Hello and good afternoon to the Royal United Services Institute from the heart of London. I'm Jonathan Isle from the Institute presenting another session of Mapping a Pandemic, our weekly view at how the crisis is affecting our activities, our life, the security of Britain, and indeed the international scene. And we are looking at today at one of probably the hottest subjects in British politics, which is the question of Britain's relationship with Europe. We're joined by a stellar team, which includes first the Right Honourable Sir David Lidington, who was Minister for Europe, had a long experience in the Cabinet Office, ending up as the de facto number two in the Cabinet of Theresa May. Lord Ricketts, a distinguished diplomatic career culminating in some of the plum jobs in the Foreign Office and as well as chairmanship of the Joint Intelligence Committee and a national security advisor to the Prime Minister. And Jan Hall, considered arguably one of the best headhunters in the city, the lady who selected most of our top chief executives and long-term experts on human resources, on what today may be called human capital. We hope to look at both what the opinions are from London and from European capitals, at both what the pressures are from above and what the pressures are from below, from the business community. And I do encourage all of you to keep your questions coming. This is a discussion that is going to be about you, about your interest and your concerns. So after the initial presentations, please use the function of the Q&As at the bottom of the Zoom app and do fire off your questions as we proceed to the formal presentations, and then we'll have a good chunk of time for questions and answers. So David, over to you.
Jonathan, I think you asked me to say a bit of start about the view from London, how the UK government would be responding. I think the first thing to say is that the reality is going to be that the COVID crisis itself is going to take up a huge amount of energy, time, bandwidth amongst ministers and amongst both senior and junior officials for some time to come at least. And the need to respond to this emergency is made more difficult in sort of logistical terms by remote working. As in so many other organizations, remote working brings with it some perils of inadequate technology. If you have somebody, a minister perhaps, who's in a constituency with poor broadband connections, then getting his agreement to a particular decision may be more difficult. And I've certainly talked to officials in government recently who say it is just taking longer to get anything agreed than it might normally do when you can get everybody in the room together and you can have a quick whispered meeting to try and sort out a compromise in a corner. So that's point one. And it is going to be a real headache, I think, for the governments. They face no good, no easy choices at the moment. The number of cases, fortunately, now seems to be dropping day by day. And there's no doubt in my mind the Prime Minister will want to try to restore something like normal economic life as soon as possible. But quite a lot of the public will have been so scared that there may be a reluctance to come back to work, to send children back to school. And some of the advice that the government is giving on public health grounds will, of course, make it more difficult for the economy to function and keep people employed. The pubs have been protesting today about and the restaurants about the 2-meter guidance. The airlines have said their piece about it not being worth their while to put planes in the air if they have to restrict passengers too much, and so on. And I think the nightmare for the Prime Minister and the Chancellor in particular is going to be what happens when the furlough period and the self-employed support periods come to an end, and are we then going to see a tidal wave of unemployment on a scale that matches the worst in previous post-war recessions, or even goes further. Then, if you look to the longer term with the economy, Rishi Sunak has got to decide what he does, both to support people in the short term, because the government will not want to see large-scale unemployment that then precipitates large-scale mortgage default, large-scale defaulting on personal and corporate loans to the financial sector, and the knock-on effects that would have through the economy. But the task for the Treasury is going to be to try to distinguish what can be justified in terms of short-term support for economic life from what may be much more fundamental and permanent changes in the structure of our economy. And it's clear, for example, that this crisis has accelerated the shift of retail online. And I think, and other services, I think, are going to be more online than had been the case already. So the signals from the government is that they don't want to go back to austerity. But if you're the Chancellor, you're also going to have an eye on the international markets. You're going to have to, if you're going to finance spending, you're going to have to borrow, admittedly at low rates, but you're going to have to be in a situation where the international lenders feel that they still have confidence that they may be repaid one day. And so there's a real economic policy challenge for the government there. Third issue is the union. And this is overlooked in a lot of commentary. But we've seen some tensions with the devolved governments in recent weeks. Actually, I think this is sometimes exaggerated, and by and large, the substance of what the different governments in the UK are doing is very similar, and it's hardly surprising that in a devolved system you either get some difference in timing and at the margins over policy. So we shouldn't get het up about that. But next year there are elections for the Scottish Parliament and for the Welsh Assembly. Boris Johnson does not want to be remembered as the last Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, as the man who lost Scotland, and Stormont doesn't vote next year. And he will, in his decisions, have half an eye on those Scottish elections in the late spring of next year. And that will affect both economic policy, but also, I think, will have a bearing on his European policy as well. And I don't want to sort of spend a great deal of time talking about what may or may not happen at the end of this year. I am more optimistic than quite a lot of commentators that there is scope for a deal. I think the stuff in both the UK and the EU positions that is very clearly padding that's put in there in order to be sacrificed if there's a deal to be done. But what is going to have to take place if there's going to be a deal is a high-level political conversation between the Prime Minister and the President of the Commission and the key heads of government in the European Union, so they can have the kind of speculative conversation about what the shape of various compromises and a potential deal might be. Because at the moment, I don't get the impression that that sort of conversation is going on at any level. But Boris will have to have a view to the impact on Scotland of, as well as on the economy, of a very hard breach with the European Union at the end of this calendar year. And I think the politics as well as the economics matter. Final point, but I think very important, is that the government, I hope, is already thinking, but is going to need in the second half of this year to think very hard as it comes out, I hope, of the COVID crisis, of the shape of its strategic relations internationally. One consequence of COVID that we've seen is the relationship between China and the United States has become more difficult than up till now. And I think it will be more difficult than in the past for any British government to steer a course between its vital political and security relationship with the United States and powerful economic relationship there, and its wish to take advantage of the huge economic opportunities that China, a quarter of the world's population, represents. I think that both those players may increasingly start saying you are either with us or against us. You can't pick and choose so much. And I think that if the government, for example, is in the mood to adopt some kind of containment policy towards China, to try and have a more assertive relationship, an assertion of Western interests in the face of Chinese power and influence, then it has to work with allies. And you can do a certain amount with Japan, Chile, other countries around the world, and I'd be very much in favor of that. But there's no getting away from the fact that you're going to have to work or find a way of working with the democracies in your own region, namely Europe, as well as with the United States of America. And I think that building new alliances in the world is going to be of critical importance. And last point of all, one of the big known unknowns in all this is the outcome of the US presidential election in November, because whether we have another 4 years of President Trump or we have 4 years of President Biden, I think will make quite a big difference as to how the United States sees its role in the world, and therefore on what kind of relationship a British government may be able to forge with that administration.
So David, thank you very much. Thank you for a rather more uplifting view than the one that usually comes up in the media, especially on the subject of the prospects of a trade deal between the United Kingdom and the European Union. Let us now turn to Lord Ricketts.
Well, thank you very much. I'll start by talking a bit about that other union, the European Union, and what the crisis may mean for EU integration, and then say a word perhaps about Britain and the EU and the implications for that. I very much agree with what David was saying at the end of his intervention there. On the EU itself, it clearly has struggled in this crisis. That's not a surprise. I think a public health crisis will always lead people to look to their national governments first. It's clearly put solidarity under. It's exacerbated already there. Borders were already a rather sensitive issue given the migrations. Now Schengen is more or less suspended with the borders up again. There were tensions between the rich north and the less affluent south already, but I think the massive economic impact of the pandemic is going to exacerbate that, leave the southern members with much greater debt, and of course drives the cushion through the EU budget negotiations. However, I think a crisis like this also aggravates things that may have been necessary anyway. And I've always been struck by the absolutely visceral attachment of the French and Germans in particular to making the EU work, making the Eurozone work, and doing whatever is necessary for that. And we've seen that in recent days with this, I think, rather significant agreement between the French and the Germans over a 500 billion euro recovery fund, the start of fiscal transfers that the Germans were always so adamantly against. And I think that we're going to see more of that. My own judgment is that the crisis is going to drive the EU towards more flexibility, more diversity of a kind that the British were pressing for when we were members, because I think given the different economic paths that countries will be taking out of the crisis, unless it is prepared to be more flexible, then it may come apart altogether. So it will be a different EU as a result of this crisis that Britain finds itself having to deal with. And so let me come on then just to talk a bit about what I think the implications are for Britain and the EU. First of all, I can't second guess where things will come out at the end of the year. I don't see the EU being prepared to compromise on its core issues, security of its single market, the EU legal order, and so on. So unless the British side are prepared to give way in some quite substantial areas, then I think the prospect is a rather thin agreement, or possibly still no agreement at all. I think that is also a risk that is there. And Brexit is well down the list of issues for other EU heads of government. It was not on the top of it anyway before the crisis. It's even further down now. And yes, of course, they will want to strike a deal. Yes, of course, it'll be necessary to have that sort of clearing of the air that David Lidington was talking about at the head of government level. But I don't think that they're going to want to spend huge amounts of time on Brexit when they have so many other pressing tensions within the EU. So whether it's a thin deal or no deal at all, and given that the pandemic is taking up so much bandwidth, the issue that I would focus on for the post-transition period would be where we are on justice and security cooperation, because there is no off-the-shelf, easy template agreement, as the British side claim there is on a free trade agreement. There's a range of different associations that third countries have with the EU, whether it's in the access to the databases or the Schengen alerting system or the European arrest warrant. But what Britain is asking for, as revealed in the texts that were published, I think yesterday, is something that goes even beyond what is available to members of Schengen like Norway and Iceland. And I don't see, honestly, how we're going to get a deal on that ambitious basis, certainly between now and the end of the year, and particularly in circumstances of a no-deal, rather abrasive departure. So I'm worried about a security cliff edge at the end of this year, and I don't see quite how the government are going to mitigate that, except in ways that are going to be much more time-consuming and slower for the security authorities. So I think that's an area of worry. I think on the foreign policy and defense agenda, the striking thing is if you look at the EU's negotiating text, there's a long chapter with structured cooperation across that agenda. If you look in the British papers, there's nothing at all. There's absolutely nothing about an agreement with the EU on foreign policy, defense cooperation. I suppose it's true that you can carry on ad hoc cooperation on foreign policy issues where you have interests that align, and you don't necessarily need a formal agreement. And in defense, it would be much better to have a structured agreement there. But honestly, I don't see the British government being interested in cooperating with the EU on defense anytime soon. But it is going to be really important that we do build up a process, a habit of close cooperation with the EU in foreign policy for some of the reasons that David says. We are still a European power. We are going to look at the tensions in the world, the confrontation that is developing between the US and China. That's going to be the generational issue for national security now. Britain has the same interests as the rest of the EU, I think, in avoiding being sucked into that and being forced to take sides, protecting our vital strategic interests in the US, but also not finding ourselves drawn into one side of a US-China long-running confrontation. We'll have foreign policy interests in all sorts of other areas as well with the EU. Climate change is obviously one. The crisis agenda in the Middle East is another. So however the Brexit negotiation turns out on the trade and economic side, we will need to be finding ways to cooperate in the post-pandemic era with our EU partners. The whole issue of the future of multilateralism is one where I think Britain and the EU will see very much eye to eye. We are middle-sized, wealthy democracies out there in a cold and sometimes hostile world. We need the international rules. We need the international structures. For all its problems, the UN remains a vital tool for countries like us to use. We will never get another global organization agreed. So we need to be working with our EU partners on whatever the new multilateralism will need for better resilience, for better crisis preparedness in the future, and on the next range of global disruptions that are coming, like climate change, like whatever will hit us in the cyber area. And so even if we don't have a structured cooperation with the EU, I think working with the EU together, but also with the French and Germans, particularly, of course, given my background, I think UK-French defence cooperation is vital. UK-German defence cooperation, very important as well. I would like to see us using the E3, London, Paris, and Berlin, as a vehicle for coordinating outside the EU. But I would not want to give up the ambition of a close working relationship across the foreign and security policy agenda with the EU. So that is, I think, my opening pitch, Jonathan. There's a lot of issues out there that I look forward to questions on, but I hand it back to you at that basis.
Thank you very much, Lord Ricketts, and thank you for that concept, not a very encouraging concept of a security cliff edge that may face us at the end of the year, which I think you were saying, if we're going to get a deal, it could be a rather thin one, which doesn't answer either the substance of our economic interests or indeed our security interests, at least as things look after the acrimonious exchange of letters only yesterday between the negotiators of the two sides. Let us turn now to Jan Hall, who I should say is joining as one of RUSI's trustees as well, but who I hope will be bringing to us a view beyond the crystal chandeliers of foreign ministries in the UK and European capitals. Jan?
Everyone. Well, yes, I'm going to try and do something that's broader, that looks from the business side, and some of it will inevitably overlap with David and Peter, but some of it I think will be a sort of a broader business perspective. And I guess probably the place to start is stating the obvious, but one thing that is certain right now is just how incredibly uncertain everything is, which of course means that what we think today will be really different tomorrow. So this, I think, is just a snapshot. If you're trying to look at the context in which business is going to operate, I think you're going to look at how business is working, you have to look at the context in which it's going to operate. And at present, we're still in a kind of suspended animation. We've not really seen the economic consequences yet. Right now, we're kind of busy in a health crisis. But as the bandwidth for governments and businesses widen, then businesses will begin to have more time to think beyond the crisis. And there's just no escaping how increasingly devastating the pandemic is beginning to look. So what's the context for business after the pandemic and of course, during the pandemic? Well, timescales, the first of many uncertainties. Most companies are currently talking in terms of 2 to 3 years. So Brexit is this year, but for companies, they're thinking beyond that already. The interconnectedness of the world, not just in supply chains, which people have talked about, but we're only just beginning to understand how everything is interlinked. And as butterflies are flapping their wings everywhere, what this is going to bring. Rebooting for business not being possible. The crisis has smashed things apart and there's no going back to where we were. So what is normal going to look like? You know, this is not a new normal. What's the new normal? There are the very big contested issues which lie ahead, globalization, democracy, privacy, inequality, and who will be the winners in all of that is going to really influence how business is making their big decisions. And then around COVID, will there be a second wave? Will the virus prove to be slower moving but more deadly in the poorest countries? Will the pandemic lead to social unrest? And how do politicians and business leaders too help to manage, because the business leaders are beginning to have to do this more, manage that delicate balance between saving lives and livelihoods, which of course save lives too. And then of course, also very big for business, last but not least, is climate change. And what we've seen is that we actually would need a pandemic, not that we want one, but we'd need a pandemic every year for the next decade to reach the Paris targets on climate change. So that is a huge amount of context to grapple with before you get into some of the current issues. So what does business see looking forward from here? Well, it's becoming clearer and clearer about the hit to the economy, but one of the things that's got people scratching their heads is the apparent disconnect between the sentiments in the equity markets and those of companies. It's partly explained by the indices. For example, the Nasdaq index in America is 40% FANGs or tech and 40% pharma and health, both of which are big beneficiaries in the crisis. Plus, the markets can see interest rates that are so low and governments pouring money in continuously. But also, according to Goldman Sachs's chief US equity strategist, it's because of FOMO. And for those of you that don't know what FOMO is, we're all not having to worry about FOMO at the moment as we're stuck at home, but FOMO is fear of missing out. And so the markets don't want to not be there just in case it keeps going up. So obviously it's not one picture for business. There are lots of pictures and there are big winners and losers. The tragedy is just amongst the losers. It's not just business as we think about it, but it is the charity, the art sector, SMEs, and many of those people who are self-employed. So that hit, a lot of the losers are not as visible, but nonetheless, it's really tough on them. There's a spectrum of views about the future of capitalism. You have, apparently Michael O'Leary the other day saying we need a future that is growth at any cost. But happily for me, at the other end of that spectrum, there are those who have a real desire in the business community to play a role in creating a kinder, more responsible, consequences-based capitalism. What's true is that everyone has already learnt enormous lessons about how it really is to be agile and move at pace. And business has now moved from the crisis phase to the coping phase, but the coping phase is just as consuming because the extraordinary detail that's required to get out of lockdown is taking up many business leaders' time. Future plans are not getting the attention they need, but already, as David said, there's a clear focus on home working. But actually, if you think about it, it's simply part of the big picture, which is accelerating the trend to digital and AI, which very sadly, and I think what you've seen businesses realizing now is the opportunity for further job reductions is, opportunity from a business perspective in some ways, but, from a societal perspective, that job loss issue becomes even bigger as people have learned that people can work from home, and AI is being able to watch how people are working, so it's learning faster. I think the other thing that people are clear about is that future investment really should focus on tech and green. Of the 70 major tech firms in the world, 60 are American or Chinese. And tech is one of the very big winners in this crisis. 60 of them American or Chinese, and almost all of them have been created in the last 20 years. Only 5 are European, and of those, 4 are more than 100 years old. So they're not only important in their own right, but they also create an ecosystem for innovation and startups around them. So investing in tech, digital and green is crucial for governments. It's also one of the key goals for the European Roundtable, which for those of you who don't know, it's a group of the 50 top business companies across Europe, top businesses across Europe. And it's Europe, not the EU. So to that extent, we will still be part of it after Brexit. There's there is an anticipation of increased government control and direction from business, not welcome necessarily in the sense of the constraints around rewards for shareholders and business leaders when people take government money, but I think ironically also a welcoming in the sense that the government may help to take strategic stakes in businesses that are going to be tried to be taken out too cheaply, or that we really just don't want to lose at all. So how does business see Brexit now? Well, the political will seems to be to go ahead, but I think the majority of the bigger companies would like to have time to discuss it and get the win of a proper deal. And so they think it would be sensible to delay. And until COVID, I think most businesses had anticipated a reasonable Brexit. The reconstruction of the world economy, though, is now where we need to be focused. So a bodged Brexit, which is the big fear, is not something that either business or the country can really afford. And that makes you kind of go, whoa, there's a real danger of a lose, lose, lose. So the first lose is Brexit itself. No, not everybody agrees that Brexit is a lose, but I think for a lot of business leaders, they would say it is. The second lose is US-China relations. David mentioned it again. Everybody agrees it's going from bad to worse, and there's a potential danger for the UK, worrying that the EU will play the role of moderating between the US and China, and the UK gets stuck in isolation or having to side with the US, which isn't the right place to be either. So worry about the US-China thing from business. So what you kind of come back to is that Brexit's no longer on its own. Brexit's a thing, but it's in a thing within a thing. And that makes it much more complicated and much harder to get the right focus. And if you are the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, Michael Gove, Dominic Cummings, who are making the decisions around this, then arguably, I think from businesses' point of view, they kind of worry that they will see an opportunity to hide what will be bad news around a no-deal Brexit under a bushel. And so if they can't get to a deal, they'll still go ahead. And for them, it kind of gets lost in the whole COVID piece. What was because of COVID, what was because of Brexit. And actually, there's a greater risk for them if they delay it and it gets more of a spotlight later. So for business leaders, it just feels like we are wasting a really crucial opportunity to actually have a proper conversation and get a proper deal. And I think that's true for European business leaders too, but they're just preoccupied, as the others have said, with other things right now. On the supply chain front, the worries about a no-deal Brexit haven't gone away, but now the European businesses and the UK businesses are much more worried about the Chinese supply chain. And people have understood that you can't just look at a piece of the supply chain, you have to look at the whole thing and look at the weakest links. And typically that's in places in the developing countries or China, Asia. So again, it takes the focus away from us. And in addition, there's going to be a real issue for business about how they collaborate with government around reshoring the essential items that need to be brought back here so they're more sustainable and resilient and flexible around healthcare, defence, agriculture and telco. Happily, one area where we seem to have won the battle, I say we seem to have won the battle, I think business feels the battle's been won, is freedom of movement and the government accepting that workers will need to come in to support key industries and the NHS. So what are the causes for hope in all of this? Well, it feels bleak, but there are some causes for hope. The virus goes away. We have a V-shaped recovery this year. It's possible. Germany and France step up and do lead and help the Southern European countries. And if they did that and felt better about themselves, might they feel better about trying to negotiate a Brexit and get the UK to cooperate? I think business is hoping that. And if the UK gets its act together, sorry, if the EU gets its act together, maybe Boris will feel more pressure to do the same. Maybe hope there. The UK will remain Europe's closest ally, whatever, and its closest trading partner. So over time, again, the hope is that they will start to come together again more. Personal one for me, Trump loses the election, and although the Democrats are being talked about as being even tougher on China, maybe if they win, they will reflect again. Hope itself, we had the Spanish flu and 2 world wars, and yet the rest of the 20th century, we saw flourishing global growth. And I guess despite the nationalistic forces at work at the moment, businesses, the bigger businesses are much more global and they take a much more holistic view. And I think they will show leadership in collaborating and cooperating within the UK, across Europe and at a global level. And I think the other thing from a business perspective for hope is that I think there's a real chance of seeing an increased wish to foster mutual social responsibility. Many business leaders really do understand their need for them to create a license to operate. But more than that, they have a genuine desire to be part of a solution for both people and the planet. And that's a huge, I guess, piece of hope. And finally, in an immense upheaval of this kind, it's made me be thinking about this, the character of countries and companies are both seriously tested. And I was going to say that my hope was both our government and our companies would come up trumps, but I didn't want to use that word. So I just want to say that I hope they will surprise on the upside. Jonathan, back to you.
Thank you so much, Jan. Surprised on the upside, although as you put it at the beginning of your presentation, we are still grappling with a very fundamental question of what the new normal is going to be like. Right, the questions are coming in fast, so let's go directly to them. I think the first questions are on the pillars, on the other pillars, as it were, of Britain's security policy in the future. The first one is on NATO. how crucial will NATO be for the delivery of Britain's defense contributions to the Northern Hemisphere? And the second one connected to that comes from Mr. Sevi Singh. There's a question from Mike Maiden, which is about our policy towards Russia, the other pillar, as it were. What are the chances of coordinating our policy towards Russia with our European partners? And what are the chances of Britain perhaps leading in that discussion? And connecting both is Tom Martin, who's asking us, given the fact that we don't seem to agree what to do with Russia, is NATO even going to be relevant as an instrument of British foreign policy and security policy in the years to come? So David, can I start with you perhaps on this one?
Sure. I mean, the really important big questions there. Point one, yes, NATO will continue to be important and I think essential to our security. And one of the challenges for every British Prime Minister, in the short term at least, is going to be to work on persuading the United States of America to continue to see that its own national interest, the interests of the American people, are tied to their support for the security of the democracies of the European continent. And that's something that we've been able to take as a read for pretty much the last 70 years, but which is increasingly under question within the United States. And while that skeptical approach is identified most obviously with President Trump, President Trump was elected by and speaks for a very significant body of United States opinion that basically thinks that the American taxpayer has been paying out for Europeans to get their security on the cheap, freeloading up till now. So whoever is president, whether it is Donald Trump or Joe Biden, I think we will see a president who expects the European powers to do more in terms of both money and in terms of political and defense leadership in the world. So, for example, I think when it comes to Africa, to humanitarian peacekeeping missions there, to sort of state building work to try to get on top of the people trafficking and the other organized crime, the terrorism coming out of Africa, then they will look to the Europeans rather than expect themselves as Americans to be taking the lead in that security work. But NATO will be important, but NATO will not be the only player. The EU, now that the British veto on defence integration has gone, will make further steps towards more integrated security policies. I don't think that we're likely to see, majority voting on this. I just can't see how Germany will ever consent to allowing its forces to be sent to war by a majority vote of others in a European Council. It's just or Council Minister meeting. I just don't see how that possibly can happen. But some of Macron's ideas about a European Security Council to give greater cohesion to the European leg of the transatlantic alliance, I think are interesting. And it's interesting, and in my view, encouraging that Macron sees the United Kingdom as a key partner in that sort of institution, which he envisages sitting outside the EU structures. But one of the virtues of the EU defence and security foreign policy arrangements is that it can bring in the countries like Sweden and Finland that aren't in NATO for historic and political reasons, and it can also enable the European democracies of the West to take action in those areas where it goes beyond the NATO remit, and where you can bring in, for example, development policy in Africa to sort of buttress your purely sort of defense policy or police training or security force training there. Russia, and the Russian challenge isn't going to go away for as long as President Putin or anybody who's like him is there. And I am moderately confident that Western resolve will hold together. I think that Salisbury was a very telling illustration of the fact that when it came to it, there was solidarity throughout the Western world with us in facing up to and retaliating for the attack that had been made upon our soil and our citizens. And that came, both the United States and the European powers did more to degrade the Russian espionage network in the West than the Kremlin had certainly expected to see happen. But it will be difficult. Putin will not be sitting on his hands. He will work on people like Salvini, like Orban, to try to sort of extend Russian influence. And he's adept at using soft power, information warfare to complement Russia's hard power assets. And my last point would be that this has all implications for our own strategic defense review. And I think the MOD, in the wake of COVID and the spending and tax pressures that there are going to be on the Treasury, MOD will come under huge pressure, even more scorching scrutiny from the Treasury than has been the case up till now. What I hope comes out of this review is a genuine alignment of defense capabilities with our strategic foreign policy priorities, because it seems to me it is what the challenge for the Johnson government now is to be clear about the United Kingdom's strategic international priorities, and then you take decisions about what defense capacities and organization you need in order to support and deliver on those national interests.
Lord Ricketts.
Thank you. Just quickly on those two really important points. On NATO, I think NATO becomes more important for the UK outside the EU because it's our main security forum for talking about essential sensitive issues with our friends and allies. So I think British leadership in NATO is vital. As David says, any American administration will want Europeans to pull their weight in terms of defense spending, and that will come under pressure in the post-COVID world. But also, if NATO is going to survive, it has to be relevant to the interests of its main member states, and that means America. And that means, in my view, NATO taking more interest in Asia, showing it relevant to the things that really matter to America. And since we in the West are all casting around for a way of avoiding, as said, strategic dependence on China, of bringing back into our countries control of the most critical technologies, perhaps NATO does have a role in being the clearinghouse where Western countries talk about the strategic threats from China and coordinate their policy towards that. Unless we can show NATO is relevant to the real interests of its member states, then it will get less vibrant over the years. That's bad for Britain. Just on Russia, I think that their strategy is divide and rule among Western countries. I don't think that they see themselves as having any role in protecting multilateralism or rebuilding international structures after the pandemic. They see it as an opportunity to exploit rather than anything else. So I don't see them as useful players in rebuilding international cooperation. But I am skeptical that the EU will ever be able to pull together a sensible, coherent Russia policy. There are very different interests among the member states, nor do I see Britain being in a position to lead that. So I think we're going to continue to muddle along with a rather confused policy toward Russia, as far as I can see. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me turn to three questions, I think, that could go directly to Jan. The first one is from Elizabeth Marshall, who's asking whether post-Brexit is not the moment for the British state to consider going back to some policies of state aid. After all, even the package which Lord Ricketts mentioned between the Germans and the French is talking about aid not only to countries, but to sectors of the economy, which means that financial aid to industries is considered, again, an objective. A second question from Joe Claxton is on the subject of how competitive do you think in technological terms Britain could remain given the current situation? And a question from one of my colleagues, an executive at RUSI, Caroline Gallup, who's sort of saying, where are going to be those competitive areas where British companies are still going to excel? I mean, even sort of standard bearers or flag bearers like British Airways are no longer British in the way that we would have traditionally described them. Jan, big questions, I know, little time, over to you.
Okay, so I think what's extraordinary is this has really changed the way that people are going to look at subsidy, and as you say, it's happening in other countries. And so if we don't do some of that now, which is so antithetical to the UK, I think people will start to really worry. So it needs a lot of debate, a lot of thought. But actually, if you are going to actually accept that you're going to bring back manufacturing onshore for key areas, then that's going to need some subsidy to start with for some firms. Some big firms will be fine, but others won't. So you're already heading that way. And I think people can really see now the threat from something like China. If our asset prices all go down and they come in and buy up our companies, that's going to feel really scary for everyone. And I think business will be loud and clear on that, but I think the public are also now much more clear about it. So I think, I don't know the answer, but it definitely is something that if you'd had this conversation last year, you'd have said, no, definitely not the right thing to do. I don't think that's true anymore. I think it's going to require a lot of thought and conversation. Where the money's going to come from all of this is a whole other question, given that we've already given lots of money to other things, but I do think it has to be looked at. In terms of tech, I would say that's one of the most important things we need to be spending time thinking about now, because we have some of the best academics in tech, we have some of the best startups, we have brilliant track record on innovation. The thing that we don't have a good track record on is taking those startup businesses and smaller businesses to become the very big businesses that you see in America and China. And that's where we really need to have a conversation nationally about how we do this. In Sweden, they have an Academy of Sciences and Business and Government where they bring all of that together, and they're national champions for all of that. We need to be national champions for our tech, because we are global leaders in the thinking and the development of it, but not in the long-term execution and monetization of it, which is madness, because it is going to be a big winner. So where can Britain excel? Tech, for sure. I think although we don't own British Airways anymore, the world still will be connected, and the sense of having expertise, we do creative extremely well, we do content extremely well, we do brand extremely well. All of those creative things we need to think about flourishing here again, because they are huge sources of competitive advantage. And actually, as automation happens in manufacturing, again, we have some of the best AI technologies that are going to enable people to bring manufacturing back on shore through AI. So I think there's a huge amount to be optimistic in that sense. And if I may just say one thing, is in all of this, linking this back to the subsidies, we're just seeing complete annihilation of the arts and culture, and I think probably charities too. They just had less focus. Theatre saying this morning, we just don't know if British theatre is going to be able to exist going forward. Well, that is an area that will fuel our competitiveness in the world, but also will fuel our hearts. So actually thinking about subsidies for that in all of this is also, I think, really, really important.
Thank you. The next question is from Sir David Logan, who, as an old hand of the Foreign Office, you would expect would have a very weighty question. And his question is on this pandemic, which sort of, in one respect, as you all said, sort of indicated nationalist tendencies, but at the same time was a reminder of how interdependent we are, despite the fact that we're looking for national solutions. So the question is there a growing gap between British policy as officially formulated by politicians, such as you, Sir David, and the real British national interests? Are we sort of diverging in almost every way? And another question from Toby Harris, who's asking, I think, also a profound one. We've heard a lot from scientists. We've heard a lot from the media. The population doesn't seem to have given much credibility to either the scientists or the journalists. So is the populists going to be the ultimate those who will inherit the earth once this pandemic is over. Lord Ricketts, would you like to start?
Well, I think the gap between politicians and the national interest is one that David will be much better placed to me than answer. But I think David Logan is right in the sense that perhaps inevitably a public health crisis draws people towards their national governments. It leads national governments to look at sort of protecting their own people, hoarding supplies of key equipment if necessary. It makes cooperation across boundaries more difficult. At the same time, it makes international cooperation more important. I think that's the dilemma of a major crisis like this, almost more so than a financial crisis where I think all countries were aware that they all either survived together or sank together. Here it does look a bit zero-sum at the moment. Of course, international cooperation in areas like vaccine research and therapies is going ahead. Scientific research has been good. But I think more generally, the point behind David's question is this a time to be signaling a kind of exceptionalist British foreign policy, different from everybody else, finding an outcome from our integrated review of strategy, which gives Britain a kind of brand as an independent operator in the world that can make a difference on its own? If that's the political push, then I think it's wrong, and I think it's misconceived, because I think Britain acting with allies and partners is strong. Britain trying to act alone in this world where the big elephants are fighting is not going to make much of an impact. Just on populism, my own thought is that populists are popular in getting elected, but once they're elected and in a crisis like this, it's competence in governing that is going to count, rather than capacity to generate slogans, and simplistic answers and wave away difficult questions. So I think populists are going to find it tough to govern and convince people at the next election that they're the right people to entrust with power.
And indeed, if you look at opinion polls in Germany, that's exactly what it indicates: the population returning the mainstream to the mainstream political parties, precisely because they put a premium on experience versus rhetoric. So, David, the gap, the everlasting gap between what politicians want to do or think they want to do and what the real national interest is.
Well, this is why you sometimes catch Democratic politicians, off duty and off the record, sort of talking longingly about what the leaders of China or Russia might be able to do, because they don't have to think about getting re-elected and about carrying the people with you for those short term of a mere 5 or 10 or 20 years. You want to stay in office. I'm more optimistic than some. I agreed with what Peter said, that populists usually get found out once they're challenged with responsibility and delivery. And Jonathan, your point about Germany was the classic contemporary illustration of that. I think it's perfectly natural for people faced with a crisis to turn to the government that says it is acting for them, that has the power to coerce them through law and to oblige them to finance its operations and policies to protect their interests. It'd be very odd, for example, to hear a number of commentators rushing to say that the EU has failed because it should have done far more in response to COVID, whereas the treaties are pretty clear that health policy in particular, but pretty well all the policies that are vital in fighting COVID are a member state competence when it comes to those countries that are members of the European Union. I think that the challenge for politicians in a democracy is how you persuade your voters that their interests, their living standards, the opportunities for their children and grandchildren are served in a visible, practical way through international cooperation. So part of this is about democratic politicians being able to demonstrate and to tell convincing, persuasive stories with good evidence that those interests do coincide. The reason I am not a pessimist on this is partly because I look at the assumptions of so many of the younger generation these days, who tend, this is generalizing, but tend to be more internationalist, grow up meeting people in all the big Western democracies, meeting people who have a heritage from many different parts of the world. That's just part of their social and educational circles nowadays, who think perhaps about spending part of their career working in another country or studying in another country, certainly visiting another country, and think nothing perhaps of getting on a plane to Japan or Thailand these days in the way that we used to think about interrailing. So what the governments and politicians have to do is to show that the somewhere and anywhere, to take the phrase, are not mutually opposed. That you can be rooted in a given place, but also see there being things that are key to your family's prospects, determined through effective international cooperation. Challenge for the British government in our current circumstances is going to be defining who they want their allies to be. And I don't believe that Boris Johnson or his government are wanting a period of glorious isolation. They know that's not a serious policy for a United Kingdom government. And I think they're serious when they talk about global Britain. We need to see flesh put on this slogan about global Britain. And I do think that there is a strong case for the UK to do more in partnership with a country such as Japan, with some of the more Western-leaning democracies of Latin America. Where I think there's the blind spot at the moment, where I am, a different place from the current cabinet, is that I think that an absolutely central, unavoidable ingredient of that pattern of productive international partnerships has to be the partnership with the Union of Democracies that's sitting on our doorstep.
Okay, I think the last question to all the three of you, and it would have to be a fairly quick response, if I may, is a point raised by Jörg Schimmelpfennig and Tom Martin, two people, which is that the catastrophic impact on the British economy of the current pandemic makes any discussion about the potential impact of Brexit a bit academic, since it'll be quite impossible to disaggregate what impact, let us say, the epidemic made as opposed to Brexit. And that therefore, paradoxically, it makes the British government contemplate leaving the trade arrangements with Europe unresolved a much easier proposition, because already there's so much scorched earth in political terms as to make very little difference. I really would ask everyone to be fairly short, but let me start with Jan.
I think that's what I think business fears. This is going to be done under a bushel, and that might suit the politicians, but it won't suit the country or business. So it is not irrelevant, because what's decided at Brexit is going to impact us over the years to come, and everything is going to matter in terms of finding growth for the economy. So it's foolhardy to think that. The worry is the politicians will take the expeditious route.
Lord Ricketts.
Yes, well, I agree with that. I think if that is the calculation, it is an extremely cynical and short-sighted one, because Brexit will have a differentially bad impact on the British economy. So in addition to being hit by all the COVID-19 pressures, British business would then be hit by a further wave of problems and uncertainties, customs and regulatory requirements. And just bear a thought for Northern Ireland, because the situation there is totally unclear. If we go into particularly a no-deal departure from the EU, what is the arrangement that exists in Northern Ireland? How will businesses operate there? That's not a pandemic induced thing. That is something that would be self-inflicted through a badly handled Brexit.
But you accept, at least in theory, Lord Ricketts, that the kind of damage inflicted by the pandemic now means that the old discussion between pro-Brexit and anti-Brexit about the impact that the process itself would do to the British economy is a bit lost. Empirically, it will be very difficult for either side to prove their case.
Well, that may be true. I don't accept that that's a fair argument, though, because, as I say, I think that Brexit will have a differentially strong impact on the British economy, leaving British business with a greater handicap even than businesses around the EU and the rest of the world, just at a time that they don't need it.
So, David, the last word is yours, and it would have to be a minute.
Right. Some people, I'm sure some advisors and pundits think that way. I think they're bonkers for the reasons that both Peter and Jan have given about the objective damage that will be done to the UK economy. I don't think that's where the Prime Minister is. I think the Prime Minister genuinely wants a deal. This couldn't be hidden. Business would make very certain that if it was the hardest of Brexits, that was the last straw, that would be shouted from the rooftops. And I think the media would pick that up and reflect that. And I think one couldn't ignore also the point I made at the start of our discussion about the impact on the union. Elections in Scotland and Wales next year. I think one of the big risks of a crash at the end of 2020 is that plays straight into a Scottish election campaign in a way that will be deeply damaging to the union.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, and thanks for the reminder that these are very many moving parts here. We're not talking about a binary confrontation between Europe and the United Kingdom in the way that it may have been portrayed in the media, especially over the last 48 hours, the battle of the letters and the publications of the various policy documents. But we're talking about a very multifaceted thing, which involves internal pressures within the United Kingdom as well. I'm very, very grateful to all of you, to the panelists, for taking part in this discussion. I'm grateful to the audience. I'm so sorry that we were not able to accommodate many more of your questions, but I hope we've done justice to the ones we picked to discuss today. It is a subject to which, of course, we will return, but I think you will agree that we had a wonderful team today. I invite you all to join us next Thursday at exactly the same time, 2 p.m. London summertime, to discuss some of the actors in this pandemic drama, the journalists, the health workers, the security workers, those who actually are the building blocks to the management of the current crisis. Meanwhile, thank you to the panelists, and it's goodbye from London, from the Royal United Services Institute. Goodbye.